to today's lecture. Today we will be focusing on substrate. Believe it or not, there are many variations of materials to print on. In this lecture, we will discuss how to define several properties of paper while providing practical examples of why these properties must be known in the graphic design and photography world, as well as the print industry. These properties include caliper, density, grain, finish, dimensional stability, smoothness or texture, and brightness. The significance of paper. Paper remains the most widely used substrate for printing, still outweighing the growing industry of poly, vinyl, and other printable materials. The paper industry is enormous, with billions of dollars in shipments made each year, shipping 365 days of the year. It is estimated that on average, each person in Canada uses roughly 600 pounds of paper a year. Even with the growing growth of email and the internet, paper is still the most common use of communication. For example, Atlantic Superstore will print and deliver 2 to 3 million flyers per week. Think about how many flyers and pieces of mail you get that you just throw out. All that stuff is printed on. All of that stuff counts as paper that goes towards that 600 pounds that each Canadian uses. How well a job reproduces on the press, then performs in bindery and finishing, depends a great deal on what it's printed on, which is often paper. Paper is often referred to as stock or substrate in the print industry. How paper withstands cutting, folding, perforating, gluing, and/or other binding and finishing processes depends on what material it is printed on. There are thousands of papers and materials to choose from, and each one can have a big effect on how the job will turn out. Making paper. Paper is manufactured from refined cellulose fibers. The leading source of cellulose is wood pulp. Wood pulp can be obtained by chipping trees, sawmill residue, recycling waste paper, and other methods. Most of the paper used today contains a percentage of post-consumer products, also known as recycled paper. Paper properties. There are hundreds of different types of paper, and each has a unique, measurable properties of characteristics. Knowledge of paper properties is important to help graphic designers, photographers, and printers to help your client find the best material for their final product. The following properties are the most important for binding and finishing production: grain, density, brightness, smoothness, weight, and finish. So all of these come into play. Think about a book. You have a thicker material for that cover of that book than you are for the sheets inside. But that quality needs to be a little bit higher than a newspaper, brochures, anything like that. All the different aspects. Is it going to be a shiny brochure? Is it going to be cardstock? Do you want something flimsy? Maybe it's a pamphlet that's a one-time use. Maybe you want to make sure it goes home and somebody can find it later. So all of these aspects are things that when you're designing or when you're discussing with a client what they want are actually quite important pieces of information. So we'll start with the grain. Grain is a characteristic of all machine-made papers. It refers to the alignment of the fibers in the paper. Paper tears and folds more easily in the grain direction than across the grain. It also exhibits greater stiffness and strength against the grain. Paper circles along the grain direction. Depending on the moisture content, paper expands or contracts more in the direction going against the grain. So the best example of that is if you've ever had a piece of paper and you put a glass of water on it and the condensation runs down the outside of the glass, getting the paper wet. And then if you notice, once the paper is wet, it'll kind of wrinkle in a certain direction. Chances are that's going with the grain. And when it dries, it becomes more obvious what that grain direction is. The effect of grain direction on bindery production can be helpful and not too helpful. Folds made parallel with the grain are neater and more resilient. Folds made against the grain may not lay as flat and folded edges can crack. Determining grain direction can be accomplished in several ways. So if you take a heavy-duty piece of cardstock and you fold it in half, if you fold it in half and you end up with a really broken, jagged fold line, chances are you have folded against the grain, versus taking a piece of cardstock and folding it, and you get a nice smooth edge like most of your greeting cards that you would find. That would mean they designed it to make sure you fold with the grain. Density. Density is the weight of the paper relative to its volume. Dense papers are more compact with their fibers, meaning they are bound tighter together. Softer, bulkier, and more porous papers can swell or shrink without much change in the overall dimension. For example, a 4-inch stack of dense paper will be much heavier than a 4-inch stack of low-density paper. So if we think about it, a regular piece of printer paper is quite dense. It's not very porous at all because it needs to be so tightly wound together just to stay together. Where a piece of cardstock tends to have more pores in it, so the ink soaks into it a little bit more, but it also means that it appears thicker, but there may not be any more material creating it. There's more air pockets. Therefore, if you have a 4-inch stack of printer paper, all that together, there's not much air, making the thinner paper heavier in an equal stack to the cardstock, which has a lot of air pockets and it's quite porous. The density of the paper can affect how easily it is maneuvered through a press and how it affects bindery and or finishing. So makes kind of sense. If it's a rigid piece of paper, it's not going to bend and move quite nicely with the rollers, so it's going to be a little bit harder to maneuver than a denser piece of paper that's going to bend. Weight. Printers use weight to discuss paper. For example, trees are sold by weight, shipped by weight, then paper is transported and sold by weight. Most paper we handle on a daily basis is a thin paper known as text stock. Items such as book covers and business cards are usually printed on a thicker paper known as cover stock. Finish. This refers to the paper's coating. A glossy paper is called coated, and a matte paper is called uncoated. Coated paper is less porous, which allows for the ink to sit on top of the paper and help reflect the light for a brighter feel. Coated paper is usually used for brochures, magazines, and high-end promotional material. Uncoated paper is a lot more porous, allowing the ink to absorb into the paper, making the colors look a lot duller. Uncoated paper is mainly used for day-to-day office use, inside of books, newspapers, and most places that are looking for a cheaper paper option. With changes to manufacturing of paper, we now have a few more finishes to choose from: matte, dull, coated on one side, silk, and satin, all allowing for your client to customize their final product even more. Smoothness. The measure of the evenness or lack of contour on the paper's surface. Smoother materials are known to have a better printable surface. Less bumps allows for more even ink coverage. Smoothness can affect bindery and finishing production, especially when the paper has a defined texture. Brightness. The measure of the brightness or whiteness of the paper. It is usually expressed with a rating of 1 to 100. Photocopy paper is usually rated at an 80, and the higher photo printing is usually rated at 95. Design and aesthetics are not the only reason for choosing a paper for a print job. Bindery, finishing, mailing, and other uses need to be considered. So bindery is anything that's once the object has been printed. So if you have a stack of business cards, you're cutting the business cards to size, literally binding books. There's many different binding methods. And then finishing is kind of like you're just putting it together, putting it in its final form. So if it's a greeting card, you're folding it in half, adding any extra pieces if there's an insert. All of those things get finished in the final piece of binding and finishing. Choosing a substrate. When choosing a substrate or material for your job, you need to think of what you want the end result to be. For example, annual report, textbook, wall vinyl, window vinyl, labels, envelopes, greeting cards, packaging, boxes, and even playing cards require all different materials. So I'm sure if you read through that list again, the material you'd want for an annual report is going to be kind of glossy, higher end. You're putting out a presentation. Meanwhile, a textbook that's going to get written on, that's going to be in and out of a backpack, it's not going to need to be as high of quality. Vinyl wall stickers versus the window stickers, they're going to change the material, maybe change the adhesive, all different pieces of the puzzle. You're not going to use the same quality of paper for a newspaper as you do for a birthday card. That's the idea. FSC certified paper stands for Forest Stewardship Council. So if you ever see this symbol on the right-hand side, that's how you can guarantee that you're using some form of recycled material. Most of the reams of paper you buy from Staples, make sure they have this. And even on the rolls of label stock that we use today, this is still a symbol that we know that has post-consumer waste. This is an international organization that promotes proper management for recycling paper and using recycled paper to make more eco-friendly paper. Well, that's it. This was a pretty heavy lecture. So let's go back to our chat to discuss.